down as to who's in attendance, and by then, hopefully, we'll have everyone.
Good morning, everyone. We're just waiting another minute or two to make sure everyone is logged in who has said they would be here, but thank you all for being here. We'll be with you shortly.
I love that Jack always uses the aerial of the sewage treatment plant as his background. You're muted, Jack.
He changes it depending on the topic.
Yes, he does.
Yeah, it's only for WPCA type meetings.
I see.
I don't use it when I'm on the tourism board meeting.
Jack is a man of many hats. He's also one of the coordinators of the Naugatuck River Greenway. He's got a bunch of things.
Yeah, jack of all trades, master of none.
Library board president.
Too many. 4 Zoom meetings today. I'm retired and I've got 4 Zoom meetings today.
Welcome to 2020.
Yeah.
All right, John, what towns? So if I'm seeing this, we have Derby, Jack and Ed, and Sonia. We have Brian, and then we have Beacon Falls, Carrie. We have Tony.
Maybe Jerry and or the operator of the wastewater treatment plant there, and Jeff Smith. We'll let them say who's coming in through Carrie's.
Oh,
Okay, yeah, Beacon Falls is here.
okay. Can you just let us know who from Beacon Falls is participating?
Jeff Smith and Tom Carey are here presently. We're waiting on Gerard Smith.
Thank you. Tony Caserta is there from Seymour.
Yes.
Anthony, how are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm well. Drew Backlick from the city of Derby is also on the call. Bruce Witchin from OPM is on the call with us today. Thank you, Bruce. Always good to have you along. Jim Galligan. Jim, I'm not sure, you representing Beacon Falls and Seymour, one or the other?
Here, I'm here for Seymour.
Okay, thanks, Jim. And Jim Stewart from the borough of Naugatuck is coming on now. Let's see.
We have a couple of phone calls in, one of which may be Black and Veatch by the
It's okay.
area code.
It's okay. So Stella Morrison is coming on from Deep right now. Keith McLiverty just came on from the city of Derby. So we need to identify 735-8087.
That's Walter Royals from Seymour.
Thank you, Walter.
You're welcome.
And let's see, who did I miss? Just Christopher, I think is the only one I didn't mention before. Oh no, so Will Walkup and Christopher, I don't want to try and pronounce your last name. If you guys can just identify yourselves.
Yeah, I'm from Naugatuck, the plant manager.
Okay, thanks. And Will?
Hi, Rick. This is Will and Mario, Black and Veatch.
Oh, how are you?
Doing all right.
That's good. I don't think I ever knew your last name. All right. So, John, who are we missing anyone we were expecting before we get rolling?
I'm just going to take a quick look at my list, but no, I think we've got, well, Sheila and or Dom Filippone from Ansonia.
Okay. But Brian is here from the WPCA. It's just
Right, and
the city is
Seymour-
not represented.
Seymour Anne Marie Dragonis was RSVP, but Tony is here.
Right.
So with that, we do have everyone for starting for sure.
All right. So I think
Good morning, Rick. Rick, I'm sorry. Rick,
Go
I'm
ahead,
sorry.
Keith.
Andrew Backlick's going to be joining us any second.
he's on. We have him on. He's here. He's appearing here by computer.
I'm here. Sorry, I'm just
Yeah.
working, so I didn't want to be unshaven.
Yeah, no, it's no problem. I shaved for all of you today.
Shave while I'm talking, okay, and then I'll be back looking pretty. Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Keith. So I think I've identified everyone who's on the call. I don't know if anyone else wants to speak up before we get rolling. Good. So it's in your hands, John, Sarah, David.
Thanks. Thanks everyone for attending. Thank you, Rick, for running through everyone who's here. I'm John DiCarlo. I'm Municipal Shared Services Director for Naugatuck+Valley Council of Governments. I'm also Project Manager for the Regional Wastewater Treatment Consolidation Study. We appreciate all your time this morning. The study is being conducted to determine alternatives to the current system of 5 plants located in the 5 municipalities of Naugatuck, Beacon Falls, Seymour, Ansonia, and Derby. As you know, we're looking for alternatives that have consolidation options that would certainly lead to significant reductions in capital and operating costs for the plants. The engineering component is being conducted by Black & Veatch, who is on the call with us. Also, the Collins Center, who's going to be leading today's workshop of the University of Massachusetts, is conducting the economic analysis and governance component of this study. Just to mention, they will note too that some of this communities and the plants may not necessarily be part of an engineering consolidation, but options for governance and or ownership of the regional plants that we have here may be something that the municipalities will want to take a serious look at. I will turn it over to David Colton and Sarah Concannon from the Collins Center, who will lead the discussion. They'll also mention how we'll take questions today, and we look forward to a good discussion.
Thanks, John. Good morning, everybody. My name is Sarah Concannon, as John mentioned. I'm from the Collins Center. I'm going to kick off our presentation this morning. I'm going to do a very quick background on the Collins Center and David and myself, and I will let you know how we are going to take questions. And then I'm going to turn it over to David and we can get into the substance of today. So as John mentioned, today is the first workshop and we're going to be discussing the governance model or the potential governance model questions we need to answer as we move forward with the work. So for those who don't know or don't remember, the Collins Center was created by the Massachusetts Legislature with a public service mission. We are located within UMass Boston, and we do consulting projects across all of the municipalities, regional government, state agencies in New England, the vast majority of which are in Massachusetts, but we do work in Connecticut and Rhode Island and New Hampshire. So our mission statement is that we're dedicated to improving the efficiency, effectiveness, governance, responsiveness, and accountability of public sector organizations with a particular focus on local and state government.
Sarah, I'm just going to interrupt you a second. I'm having difficulty hearing you. Your voice is kind of in and out for me, and I have a pretty good connection. So I'm just wondering if anyone else is having the same problem.
Yeah, your voice is a little wobbly.
Yes.
Okay. Let me.
Oh no, you're perfect.
Now it's better. Now it's good.
I think you're just too far away from the mic.
All right, I'm not going to move then.
Thank you.
Thank you for letting me know. So the way that the Collins Center is organized is that we've got a cross-disciplinary team of consultants with decades of experience working in municipal, regional, and state governments. A lot of our associates are retirees from those types of governments. And we do consulting on all aspects of public governance and management. And as a member of this whole team that NBCOG has put together, we bring expertise in governance structures, the legal underpinnings of regional entities, especially for wastewater districts, the facilitation of organizational change from everything from the legal aspects to the political aspects, and a sensitivity to local history and control and issues of representation. This is the team that we put together to work on the project. So you can see David and I up there. David Colton is the lead on the project, and like I said, you're going to hear from him in just a few minutes. He works across multiple practice areas at the Collins Center. He has been the CEO of Towns and has also worked as the Commissioner of Public Works in municipalities here in Massachusetts with oversight of public utility systems. My name is Sarah Concannon. I also work across various practice areas in municipal management and operations. I right now lead the finance practice area at the Collins Center. And we also have two team members who you don't see and who are sort of helping us behind the scenes. Marilyn is one of our government structure experts, and Tony is one of our finance experts. And so they will be helping David and I as needed as we get into the deeper into this work. David?
Okay, thank you, Sarah. Can everybody hear me okay? Good, thank you. So we're committed to produce two main deliverables for Naugatuck+Valley Council of Governments. And first is a recommended governance model for the preferred wastewater region. Now, we don't know what the makeup of that region is yet, but there are preliminary steps that we can take to get to that decision, and today's workshop is one of those. Part of that is to include a draft of bylaws for the region and a representation model, how the member communities will be represented at the regional authority, and rate setting procedures. Our second deliverable is a cost-benefit analysis that show the capital and operating costs, operating maintenance costs in the regional model versus the base cost or the status quo cost of the individual communities in aggregate. This cost-benefit analysis will be the subject of probably of a standalone workshop when we get to that point. The agenda today is, and these times are very approximate, but just to give us an idea of hopefully how we'll be able to get through this today. We're going to review a couple of different ownership models. We'll discuss the strengths and weaknesses of each of those, and that will be, hopefully we can get through that presentation in about a half an hour. That will be followed by a question and answer session. We've allotted 30 minutes. We'll wrap it up with a little summary. We'll talk about consensus, and we'll preview the next workshop at the end. So we've put this together to be as brief as possible to hold everybody's interest here. Sarah is going to talk about the logistics of asking questions.
Great, thanks, David. So we're going to use the chat function to ask questions. This is a screenshot, and I hope you can see the yellow arrows that point to the places you're going to need to go to use the chat function. So down at the bottom of your screen, within the Zoom window, you should see a little box that says chat and has a little thought bubble. When you click that, this screen will come up, this little window here, and this is where you can type your chat message and send it out to everybody. So while we go through the presentation, if you have a clarifying question, you missed something or you didn't understand something, go ahead and type the question right into the chat box. If it's a simple question that I can answer in the chat, I will. I may pose it to David at a convenient time in the presentation, such as a slide transition, or if it's a substantive question, I will hold it and ask it during the Q&A session. If you have substantive questions, definitely hold them until the Q&A session, questions or comments. And when we get to the Q&A session, you can simply type question into the chat. And then we can unmute you, or you can unmute yourself once I call on you, and then we can ask the questions in the order that they are received. If you're on the phone, you can't really use the chat function, so you'll just have to pipe up if you have a question. And at the end of this workshop, we are going to be sharing a recap of the day, and it will include an overview of the questions and answers.
Thanks, Sarah. So to kick this off, we really have a threshold decision to make, which is about the ownership model that we prefer. And the question is, will local ownership of the collection systems be maintained by the local WPCAs or transferred to the regional authority? It's a given that treatment works and other shared facilities will become part of the regional authority if one is created. But the question remains of what happens to the local collection systems, wastewater systems in the individual town. This decision will affect every aspect of our work for NVCOG, and particularly the financial, representational, and structural organization. Before I get too far, I want to let you know what I mean when I say ownership in this context. It can be an actual ownership and fee, right? The deed could be transferred to the regional authority, or it could be some kind of long-term lease or other form of agreement that gives control and custody of the facilities to the regional authority. The regional authority would be responsible for operating and maintaining the facilities, financing operations, the maintenance, capital improvements, assessing charges, adopting rules and regulations, and complying with all permits and other legal requirements. Again, the question is whether they have this responsibility for the local collection systems as well as the treatment works. So it's a threshold question. It's essential that we get to a answer to that question before we can proceed with the rest of our work. So the first ownership model we want to look at is what we're referring to as the full regional ownership model. It's when the locally owned wastewater systems are transferred in their entirety to a newly created regional water pollution control authority that collects, transports, treats, disposes of all wastewater generated by the member communities. It develops rates and charges, rules and regulations, and billing systems. And importantly, it would provide customer service directly to the end users of the system. This means that in this model, the local water pollution control authorities would cease to exist. They would no longer have a role. Next slide shows you a little graphically how this kind of works. You can see the local WPCA is fading away, and the flow from residents and businesses to the regional water pollution control authority. That customer service relationship is represented, and it shows a couple of the responsibilities of the regional water pollution control authority. One thing that should be emphasized here is that a regional water pollution control authority in this ownership model would develop a retail wastewater rate, which they would bill directly to the residents and businesses in the entire district, a single rate. And that rate would most certainly continue to be based on water consumption as a proxy for sewer use, as the individual communities currently do now. Some examples of where a full ownership model is successfully used today in southern New England, particularly in Connecticut and Rhode Island. Of course, the Hartford region, the New Haven region, the Providence, Rhode Island region, Narragansett Bay Commission, and West Warwick, and also in Rhode Island. They're good examples of places that use this ownership model in southern New England. This model is not used in Massachusetts. And this model tends to be used, although not exclusively, but tends to be used in large regions that are heavily influenced by a major urban center. As you can see, Hartford, New Haven, Providence. Massachusetts is the exception here, where the largest urban centers in Massachusetts, such as Boston, Worcester, and Springfield, do not use this model. They use the other model that we're going to be talking about. So the second model.
Before we move ahead, David, I just want to clarify with a question from Rick. Although this model does show one single treatment plant, the regional system may not necessarily have one single treatment plant. It may include multiple plants.
That's correct. That's correct. We, for simplicity on the graphic, we showed one, but it could be multiple, obviously. Of course, it could. So the second model is what we're calling the partial regional ownership model. This is the most common form in southern New England, where the locally owned wastewater treatment works are transferred the treatment works. I'm sorry, I got a little mental glitch there. The treatment works are transferred to a newly created regional water pollution control authority. Just the treatment works and other shared facilities. There may be force mains and interceptor pipes and pumping stations that are shared by multiple communities. They would also be transferred. So anything that's shared by multiple members of the region. They would treat and dispose of all wastewater generated by the member communities, and they would develop a wholesale rate, a wholesale assessment that they would charge to each of the regional communities, each of the member communities, and they would bill the member communities. In this model, the member communities maintain the customer service relationship with their end users. They establish a retail rate and rates. The retail rate would include the assessment charged by the region. So in other words, all of the costs associated with running the treatment works and some of those shared facilities would transfer to the region. The region would bill that cost back to each individual community using an assessment formula. And then the local water pollution control authorities would continue to bill their customers as they do today. The following slide kind of represents this model, where you see the local WPCA is still viable. And of course, there would be multiple, depending on the size of the district, local WPCAs, and they would be responsible for setting the retail rates. This model kind of represents the least amount of change from a customer perspective. The customer will continue to interface with their local water pollution control authority. They'll continue to call the same office that they call when they have a problem, or they need continue to pay their bills to the same place. So their experience with the region will not really change. The change occurs in the relationship between the local water pollution control authority and the regional water pollution control authority. The regional authority would develop rules and regulations which each community would have to follow, and the wholesale rate assessment.
And in this model, David, the flow is measured.
Right. Okay. Yep. In this model, the flow would be the flow would be measured as it moves from the local collection system to the shared facility. There would necessarily need to be some way to measure actual wastewater flows in order to provide this assessment. You really can't rely on water consumption as a proxy at the regional assessment level here. You need to actually measure the flows, and that is done in many regional authorities. There is accurate flow measurement facilities, and in some cases there need to be estimates, but that's way into the weeds. We can get to it in the future. Examples of how this partial ownership models that is successfully operating in southern New England. One is right in Connecticut, the Mattabasset region, which, as I'm sure you all know, is the New Britain, Berlin, Cromwell, Middletown, Connecticut area. It's been using this model for decades. The Massachusetts Water Resources Authority, I put that in there. I mean, is not really a comp for what we're trying to do because the MWRA is just so large and much more complex. But if you look at the Worcester, Massachusetts region and Newport, Rhode Island, and so forth, this model is used by large regions, but it is also used by small regions. So, for example, you'll see on the screen the Mansfield, Norton, Foxborough region in Massachusetts, which is about a 4 million gallon a day wastewater treatment plant that handles the wastewater for those 3 communities. That's in the ballpark of the size of system that we'll probably end up with here, and maybe even smaller. But it's a good example of how a small region organized itself and got together and provided the service to their constituents. So that's the partial ownership model examples. So we'll go back, begin this discussion of the strengths and weaknesses here by talking about the full ownership model and its strength. Clearly, with a full ownership, with one entity owning the entire system, it reduces the need for coordination. It's an easier system to manage from a top-down looking perspective, from the perspective of actually from the authority. The compliance effort is consolidated. As most of you understand, the NIPDES permit, it really cares about what comes out of the end of the pipe. But complying with the NIPDES permit requires effort within the collection system, because that's where what comes out of the pipe originates, and also it requires maintenance of the treatment works. So the regulatory compliance effort is a little bit simpler with a full ownership region. The region does not have to work through the local communities to make efforts for compliance with the regulations and the permit. It produces an economy of scale in purchasing, economies of scale in purchasing and labor. The larger the region, the more opportunity for bulk purchases, for sharing of labor, probably even some equipment may be redundant in individual regions that could be shared across a larger region. A key point in all of this is that the user fees are consistent across the region. And we'll get into how that's kind of a double-edged sword. The rate, if we have let's have an imaginary 5-town, 5-city region, every user in the region, whether they're in, no matter which city they live in, would be charged the same rate per gallon or per 100 cubic feet of water consumption. And that's a strength here, but you'll see later it's also a weakness. So the weaknesses in the full ownership model. Obviously, local control is diluted, right? There's some loss there of local control. Looking at it from the perspective of an individual business or residential property owner in a city, they may feel that loss of local control. They may feel, think of it as the sewer department becoming like the electric company, and sort of a little extra distance between you and the people providing you the service. Now, equity here can be a weakness. Perceived equity, especially the perception of equity. In a full ownership model, the costs are spread across the region. So if, for example, one of the collection systems is in, excellent condition and is, is a lower cost to operate and maintain compared with another system that may be older and require more maintenance costs, or may be on the verge of needing to be replaced and has a huge capital cost looming. In a regional system, the cost of that is spread across the entire region. So people in a town or a city that have already paid for a highly functioning system will feel like they are that there is a lack of equity, that they are going to end up paying for another town system. So that equity issue is a weakness, and it needs to be addressed in the modeling for the system when we get to that part. The financial complexity is greater in the full ownership model as well. In order for the region to be created, all of the systems need to be transferred in some form of ownership, and therefore they have to be valued. And getting to a place where that value is equitable can be very tricky. So some of the reasons I just mentioned regarding the condition of the systems, and there really is no one way to do this. This would be a subject of negotiation. It would be a challenge to negotiate an equitable valuation of collection systems in particular. And in that, there could be the creation of some cross-region subsidies where one community is subsidizing the operations of another community, or they perceive that they're subsidizing the operation of another community. The final point is the flow measurement. As we said, in this model, most likely water consumption would continue to be used as a proxy. So looking at our fictitious 5-member system, you have 4 systems that measure water consumption relatively accurately. They're at or near 100% accurate in measuring their water consumption. But community number 5 has an older metering system, and they're measuring it at 75 or 80% accuracy. Well, what that does is it undermeasures 1/5, 20% of the system, and the other 4/5 have to pick up the difference. So it puts upward pressure on the rate that everybody pays. If the rate is higher than it should be, then the people with the more accurate measurement system are going to pay a higher bill. I think that might bear repeating. It's simply, you know, if the rate is determined by cost divided by consumption, and consumption is not accurately measured, then the rate is going to, and consumption is understated, particularly, the rate is going to be higher, right? It's simple division. So that's that's something that needs to be accounted for when you're putting this together. So partial ownership. So it can be viewed as a strength that the local communities maintain oversight of operations and costs. They have a little bit more control over their individual, how they operate their system, how they staff it, and they have more opportunity to control their costs than they would in the other system. It continues that local relationship with the customers, and it gives the local authority more the ability to influence the user fee more directly. Obviously, in a full regional ownership, regional system, there would be representation on the regional authority board, so there would be influence on the user fees. Not to say that there wouldn't be any, but in this case, with the partial ownership, they have a little greater ability to influence the user fees because they are controlling their own costs of operating their system. So financial complexity is a little less. The valuation systems are limited to the treatment works. And it's a little bit easier to value a piece of property with a plant on it than it is to value an entire collection system with, piping that some piping may be fully depreciated, some of it might be brand new. You've got a fairly complex valuation dilemma in that case. So there's lesser concern for cross-regional subsidies, and the differences in usage measurement are minimized. The accuracy is minimized. When you go to a partial ownership, as we said before, you have actual flow measurement to account for the cost to measure, to be able to use to develop the rate for the assessment for the treatment works and the associated facilities. Therefore, it's more accurate. You're actually measuring the flow. You're using that flow measurement to develop the assessment, as opposed to using a proxy like water consumption. Now, the local cost would still be using water consumption as a proxy, but each individual community would be using their own measurement. So if one community is under measuring compared with another, it doesn't matter as much because they're not affecting what people in the other communities pay by under measuring their water consumption.
It might be worth also just making the point that that is no different from the way it works now, measuring it
exactly
consumption. There is no change. The only change would be the treatment portion gets measured accurately and comes through an assessment.
Correct. And so obviously, if you're going to develop a user fee for anything, right, it just makes sense that the closer you can get to accurately measuring the thing that you're charging people for, the better, the more accurate the rate is, and the more fair the system is going to be. So partial ownership weaknesses, there can be inconsistent application of rules and regulations. The regional authority develops those rules and regulations and imposes those. And I should, as an aside, mention one of the side effects, if you will, of this system is that the regional authority becomes somewhat of a regulatory agency for the local authorities. Right, they're going to be imposing rules and regulations on the local water pollution control authorities. It'll be up to the local WPCAs to apply those rules and regulations within their community. So if you have, back to our fictitious 5-member region, you're going to have 5 different applications of the rules and regulations. So there's additional coordination, and it limits the economies of scale. But those can be mitigated fairly easily with joint purchase agreements, labor sharing agreements, and equipment sharing agreements through the system. So what's the implication of all this for us? Well, if we're going to be developing a rate structure, we need to know, is it going to be a wholesale rate structure or a retail rate structure? We can't, we can't do both. It would be a waste to do both. Also, methods of flow measurement and cost allocation are different in each scenario. There are intermunicipal economic and business issues, particularly those valuation issues. How do facilities, how do equipment, how does it get valued? What happens to the labor force in each community if it's consumed by one regional authority? Of course, the representation model can be different through each of these structures. Currently, I've met with a lot of you, and we've talked about how you currently set up with your representation on your local water pollution control authorities. And there's not a lot of structure there. There's not a lot of requirements for being on the board. Although most of you have somebody with some financial background and have somebody with some operational background, most of you don't have that as a requirement. If you're going to eliminate all of the local water pollution control authorities and replace it with one main authority, you're probably going to be looking at a larger board with some requirements for appointment to the board to make sure that you have the right mix of expertise on that board and the right mix of representation. Either that, or you may end up with as some of these regions do, is have a board of directors, and that board of directors has one or more advisory boards that work with them, maybe one on operational issues regarding wastewater and one on financial issues. So you may get into a more complex representational model in the full ownership scenario than you would in the partial. Caveat there: if we end up talking about a very small district of 2 or 3 communities, it might be less of an issue. Particularly 2 communities, probably less of an issue, but it could affect the representation law. And then, of course, the cost-benefit analysis structure. Obviously, the differences in flow measurement and the differences in rate calculation are going to affect the cost-benefit analysis. So, with that, I think it's time we started addressing the questions.
All right. So we've got this screen up, which provides an overview and a summary of the strengths and weaknesses. And we'll leave this up during our discussion for folks to reference. So David, the first question, and I'll just read it,
Okay.
is in a partial model, can you clarify how the flow is measured twice, once by the local WPCA and once by the regional entity?
Sure. It's not really measured twice, but I can see how you might come to that conclusion. The regional authority measures the aggregate, what each community as a whole produces. The local authority breaks that down to the individual user. So one of the interesting things about that system is that consumption is not going to be the same. You're going to be using 2 different measurements. The aggregate measurement of what's coming out of that city, what that city is producing and transporting to the region, is measured by its actual flow. How much flow is actually going through a meter, or is being measured by pumping records at a pumping station, or some other form of measurement. The billing is still going to be continued to be based on water consumption within the individual. So if you aggregated the water consumption of the entire community, it's not going to be, maybe by some mathematical miracle, it would end up being exactly the same amount, but it will never equal. They will never be the same. I hope that was clear enough. It's difficult to do.
That question was from Rick, and I'll let him follow up.
Thank you, sir. What I was trying to get at, David, was if you're measuring the inflow to the plants from a municipality, and that measurement is all the water, everything that's going through that pipe into that plant. But in the partial ownership system, the municipal board is still going to be measuring water use at the source using whatever system they use. So there's a measurement there, and then there's a measurement at the wholesale end. So, and I might as well just get to the other question, which is I&I. So it sounds like there's going to be in this type of a system, municipality, let's assume you can equalize all the costs for the plants and the major pieces, pump stations, things like that for regional ownership. And there could be some sort of equalization of payments at the front end to get the communities on the same footing for the infrastructure that the region will own. But then you have the collection systems that are going to remain under local control. And the difference in those collection systems and how efficiently they function, or how much inflow and infiltration they have, is going to generate a radically different number from water consumption. So you've got a wholesale price from the region, you've got water consumption being measured locally. The difference between those two, it almost creates an incentive for the local authorities to make their systems more efficient, an incentive that really isn't there today quite so much. Would you disagree with that?
No, I would. If you had in the partial ownership scenario, you're going to be billed based on how much wastewater you send to the treatment plant. So if you have high II, your bill is going to be higher. The Mattabesett region, for example, uses two ways to develop two measures to develop their rate. One is the flow for operation and maintenance costs, but for capital costs, they allocate, each community is allocated a certain percentage of the treatment plant capacity. And they pay for the capital costs of the plant based on their allocated percentage. And then there are penalties in place if they exceed that. And that's where, as I said, the regional authority becomes somewhat of a regulatory agency, because they're going to have to impose regulations on the communities about II, right? Because they have to keep the plant operating efficiently, and if they let it get overrun with II, that's going to blow the whole thing up. So obviously, they need to enforce a regulation on I&I within each community. One of the things that happens in a full ownership in terms of II is the engineers on the call can back me up on this, is that when you do an I&I program, I&I reduction program, you're looking at the reductions, the work that is the most cost effective, right? That is going to be, you end up with a list from the most cost effective things you can do to the least cost effective things you can do. In a partial system, you're going to have a list for each community. And the most cost effective in a community, in any particular community, may not be the most cost effective in the entire region. So the two, in a full ownership, you're going to have one list. And the top 10 things on that list might be in one town. So one town ends up getting all the money back. That's another equity issue in the full ownership arrangement.
The only reason I asked the question, before I let you go on this, because I promise I'll be quiet, but the only reason I raised the issue is because it opens the question of what assumptions you're going to make when you get to the cost benefit analysis. And I want to make sure that all the towns have the same understanding and are on the same page going into the cost benefit analysis, and that there's whatever assumptions are going to deal with those differences between the wholesale flow, I'll call it the wholesale flow and the retail flow, how we're going to handle that, and whether the engineers need to provide information to you in order to make your best guess at that.
Understood.
Before we move on to the next question, I just want to take David's last point one step further. In that scenario where all of the highest ROI, return on investment, I&I reduction happens in one community, nonetheless, the entire region benefits from the ability to maintain the plant's capacity. So
Correct.
even though the work is done in one community, it still benefits the region overall and in the long term. So I just wanted to make sure there was that.
Excellent point, Sarah. You know, it does benefit the region. As I said it way earlier on, the NIPTES permit doesn't care, right? It cares about what comes out the end of the pipe and the quality of what's coming out the end of the pipe. It doesn't care how you get there, really. So having a treatment plant that is operating at full efficiency and meeting all the conditions of the permit is in everybody's benefit in the entire region.
Yeah. So I'm going to go back to the beginning, and there's a gentleman, James Stewart, if he could unmute and get ready to ask his questions. He actually has 2 questions, so I think he could just ask both now while he's on the line here.
Am I here? Oh, here I am. The first question was, under your first full ownership model, why can't the regional WPCA break down the costs for various treatment plants and collection systems based on what it costs and not send out equal billing to everybody?
I suppose there's a way to do that. It's not something that I've seen done anywhere. It's not something that's done in practice. I suppose it could be done where you actually, if you have a crew of workers that flushes sewers or does crack sealing in pipes or whatever they do, and I suppose you could have a system where you keep excellent records and track of how much work they do in each community. And then have some kind of formula for accounting for the overhead that you're going to have to spread across each community. Yeah, I suppose it's possible to be done. It's just something that isn't done.
Okay, the next question is, does the regional WPCA purchase the system, or is it just transferred over? And what happens to the existing debt the municipality has?
There's the rub, right? That's part of the issue with equity, the equitable valuation of the systems. That is, it's entirely negotiated. The municipalities entering the system would have to come to some kind of terms on that. Of course, we'll have some recommendations on that as this goes along, but that's the kind of thing that it varies from place to place. Certainly, it would be very difficult to explain to a city council, for example, that because your collection system is fully depreciated, it doesn't have any value, therefore the regional entity isn't going to pay you anything for it, yet you still have 5 years left on your bonds. That isn't going to sell, right? We all know that. So all of those things need to be taken into account when this is put together. An excellent question, but one that I can't answer today.
If I could on this one, so Jim, we've used a model in the school consolidation studies that where what they actually do is go in and value the properties, the value of the actual infrastructure in each city. And then there's a payment to equalize what you have going in. So if you contribute all of your infrastructure to the regional system, you get a credit, if you will, for that buy-in with your infrastructure. And then there's a difference between the various communities in terms of how much of the system they're going to use and how much it's costing them to buy in. And I think under a scenario like that, some towns would issue debt to buy into the system, to own some of that more recent infrastructure, and some towns would benefit by receiving, effectively receiving money that might subsidize, say you have a brand new plant and you're going to process a whole lot of effluent for a bunch of other cities. You know, the payment works the other way. But I think this kind of drives us to the question of full ownership versus partial ownership. And it's worth recognizing, with the exception of Beacon Falls, we all have a pretty messy collection system. There's nobody that's in really good shape. All of us have systems that date to the 19th century. And so when we're considering whether it's full or partial, and we're worried about the collection system, as I said, with the exception of Beacon Falls, which has a relatively new collection system, you want to keep that in mind when you're considering the two and whether it's worth it. I mean, normally I would say I think partial ownership seems to make more sense to get rid of all those issues of the collection systems and so forth. But that's really an engineering and money decision. Yeah,
if I can add, you know, one thing to keep in mind when you're thinking about all of these is it's a zero-sum game, right? Unless there's some third-party influx of money from the state or the feds or somebody else, every dollar is generated by the region and by the individual communities that make up the region. Every dollar that goes in and every dollar that goes out. If there's a financial transaction that benefits community A, well, communities B, C, D, and E have to pay that for that benefit, and vice versa.
Did that answer Jim's question?
Sorry. Yeah, no, that's fine. I understand. Thank you.
Yeah, hi, this is Tony Caserta. Just along those lines, the 5 different communities, they're all at different stages of development. And, you know, within those communities also, there's a percentage of the number of properties that are tied into the system. How would we deal with any, you know, future developments, and how does that affect the overall wholesale rate? And also, as you mentioned before, in case there are any subsidies, what are some of the regulations that the feds have in terms of providing grant monies and requiring communities to have a certain percentage of their properties tied in?
Okay, so on the first half of that question, that's really something hopefully we'll be able to rely on Black and Veatch to help us with, because in their study, I believe part of their study is to look at a future condition, right? As we will, when we look at the cost benefit, we're going to look at what it costs now. We're going to look at what it costs at a date in the future. The same date that Black and Veatch uses for their predictions of the future. And that predicted future condition will include capacity and how much capacity is needed in the treatment plant. So it should encompass what the growth will be. As far as the other half of the question, the federal government really has been absent on the funding of wastewater facilities for quite a few years now. So I wouldn't expect them to come across with any money. They do require, there are EPA regulations regarding user fees and how, and do they really have to be in place. But other than that, the federal regulations, and I'm not an expert on all of the federal regulations, but I don't think there's a lot there that that's going to affect your question.
David, I'm going to jump in because Tony's question is a good one. And there are some things we've discussed in previous meetings, but it's probably worth revisiting a couple of them. So on the Black and Beach study, and they're free to please speak up and clarify or disagree. But the Black and Beach studies are based upon what the towns reported in terms of their use and anticipated growth. And I'll be honest with you, those studies are pretty thorough. If you haven't had a chance to look at all of them, they're very, very detailed in what they lay out over a 20-year horizon for costs, capital costs of towns. If anything, they underestimate what should be invested in collection systems because they just put a number on it on a percentage basis. But philosophically, I think in terms of subsidizing the operation from the feds or requirements. So Stella is on the call from Connecticut Deep. I don't expect her to answer questions like this today, but I will say this. One of the things that was a motivating factor in taking on this study was that 5, 6 towns, once you get beyond our study, we're looking at capital investment costs that were huge, that were eventually going to make their way in plans in front of DEEP for clean water money and some sort of subsidy, which was going to cost all the taxpayers a whole heck of a lot of money, close to $500 million just when we're talking about plants and pump stations. So the idea is that if we come up with a cost-effective system that's going to be less expensive to build out the processing infrastructure and maintain it, that we might be able to bring a proposal to DEEP that they would look favorably on and help us to advance as a model for the rest of the state.
I'm going to go back to Keith McLiverty. He had a question about equity and subsidization.
Yeah, I'm all set. He addressed it. I typed it.
Okay.
He nailed it right a minute later, so I'm all set. Thank you.
Great. Wanted to make sure. I don't have any other questions. Who else has a question or a comment?
Of course I do. I want to see if anyone else has something to say first. I have one more thing. I'll just go. One of the things we didn't touch on that I think would be under consideration probably for partial ownership, if not full ownership, is privatization of the operator of the system. There, since we've started this study, we've been approached by at least 3 national companies who are interested in building and operating. They'll take over the infrastructure that works and build out new and make a proposal to the region. And when I say the region, I don't mean the NVCOG. I mean those of you who may decide to join together in such a system later. So there are private companies who are willing to build and operate these systems in return for long-term agreements. I think it's something that we should be keeping in the back of our mind. The city of Waterbury, one of the reasons they didn't join this study is because they did that and they turned over operation to Jacobs last year. So it is something to think about. It may not appeal to some towns. It may appeal to a group of towns. We'll see as we get forward with the engineering piece of this, how many actual towns can be operated as a system. The last thing to remember is just because you have a regional partial ownership system doesn't mean everything's necessarily going to be connected. There are high costs of running pipe between areas to connect them to processing plants. The region could own that processing facility that's disconnected from your particular area, but it could still be part of a regional system. All right. I'm done.
And just to further clarify, if you didn't get it when Rick first mentioned it, these companies that have approached us, aware that we're doing this study, have the opportunity to build and own the system themselves, and the municipalities become their client, as well as just manage the system so that's the other opportunities out there.
Are there any other questions or comments? We'll give folks a minute to unmute themselves.
Yeah, I have one question.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so I think the one thing that, it's down the road, but the one thing that we have to navigate is the consumerism side of this. You know, while we're all a valley, the town lines are really, really tall. And getting over the hurdle of one town and ratepayers subsidizing the other town can't be minimized. I mean, towns trying to just get shared services, getting through legislative bodies and drafting the language has been slow at best in the valley. Forget regionalizing new things. So I think the hurdle there, and if we could think of it in parallel to what's going on now, is how to market this in a way that it becomes sellable. You know, my concern for us as Derby is, you know, we're behind the times in our plant maintenance. We're behind in our upgrades. We have a bond referendum to do some of this, but our plant has issues as our system does. So, you know, quickly do we become the enemy in this process to the town that properly funded and maintained its plant? I just get concerned with a lot of finger pointing coming out of this. And then how do you sell it to the town that's in good shape, but now they're sharing the burden of the town that might be a little behind? That's just a pause I have, Rick, just a concern, you know. I'm not saying stop. I'm just saying to me, that's a big hurdle.
Yeah, the only way this works is if it stabilizes capital and operating costs for everyone. You know, there might not be as much of a benefit for some communities as others, but the ability to grow and share the infrastructure and share that capacity for economic growth in the future, I think is important. The other thing I think that we have to remember is it's the system, whether we've invested properly or not, community by community, the cost is getting uncontrollable for everyone. You know, I would say with the exception potentially of Naugatuck, who does not have a user fee right now. And I didn't mean to, I don't mean to imply they may have one in the future. I didn't say that, Jeff. But you know, they don't have a user fee, so there may be less attraction for them here in a system like this. But it could come down to just, you know, 3 or 4 or 2 communities who decide to work together on this project at the end. But I agree with you. I understand your points, Keith. I live it every day. But I think that as we go through this and we identify, you know, we're going to look to people like the finance directors like yourself to look at the cost benefit analyses and determine really what kind of sense those make for each of the towns. Particularly those towns, you know, Ansonia is the only town that has updated its plant in the last decade. Everyone else is really far out and facing significant costs. So we're kind of all in the same boat. And even with all due respect to Ansonia's investments, you know, they're now coming up on, you know, a decade of age and have to start making plans for the future as well. So anyway, that's how I view it at this point. But it's ultimately, this is going to be up to the towns and the WPCAs. Ultimately, that's where it all lies. You know, we can only put together the scenarios and give you options.
So Keith's concerns about issues of equity and subsidies, David, would argue more for or support the partial ownership model, right?
Right, there'd be less concern over that in a partial ownership because you're not dealing with all the individual collection systems.
And because the flow measurement is accurate, there are no questions about whether one with a better collection system is subsidizing others who are, you know, who have a lesser performing collection system in terms of
Right.
or metering.
Each community is more accurately in a partial ownership. Each community is more accurately paying its own freight, and and they're not paying somebody else's freight. And provided you have an accurate measurement system for the wastewater flows, and you have a good agreement on the allocation. Say, for example, you were going to use the Mattabasset model where the assessment is determined by flow and by percentage of use of the system an allocation of the capacity of the treatment plant. And that allocation would account for, to go back to an earlier question, would account for growth in that community. Provided you have good agreement on that allocation and everybody's happy with their allocation and you're measuring the flow accurately, those cross-subsidy issues should just go away.
Does anybody else have a question or a comment related to that or anything else?
I think it was a pretty thorough presentation. I think you guys covered a great deal of information and did it well. I think maybe it might be time to move on to next steps and an understanding of when we're going to meet next and discuss what.
Okay.
Okay.
We will go to the next slide.
So obviously, you know, we're going to be making a recommendation on the ownership model. That's you know, part of our job. And of course, we're going to take into account your input and the input of NVCOG, the experiences of other regions, best practices in Southern New England, any technical considerations that Black and Beach might identify, and you know, of course, our evaluation of all these factors. This workshop is only one step in that process, but the next step will be an online survey. Sometime next week, we will be emailing each of you an online survey that you can take so that you can let us know your preferences with regard to the models. And of course, anybody wants to let us know their preferences right now, happy to hear it. Anybody wants to let, you know, if you've already made up your mind, that's fine. But, you know, we'd encourage you to take a few days to give it some thought and wait for the survey. And, you know, strongly encourage you to respond to the survey. We need your response. We need to factor in how you feel about this. That's a very big part of the process. So that's the most immediate next step. Also, as Sarah said, she'll be sending out a recap of the meeting with all the questions and so forth. And I imagine you're going to send everybody a copy of the presentation.
Yes.
And NVCOG will be putting this up online, right? It's being recorded. So you'll be able to go back and look at it again if you need to. Correct?
Yeah, yes. But John, we're putting it on our YouTube channel and our
It'll be on
website?
the YouTube channel, but there will be a link on the study page as well to go to it directly from there. And we'll send it out to everybody who was here as well as all the stakeholders in general, so they can see it. You know, they'll have a link to it in an email.
Good. Thank you.
So the date of the next workshop has not been set, but it'll be held sometime later this fall. And it will discuss the representational model, so we'll go into how each community would be represented on or could be represented on a regional authority during that workshop. We'll discuss the enabling. Connecticut has actually a very good piece of legislation, Chapter 446K, which is the legislation that created the New Haven, that the New Haven district was created under. It's actually quite good, and we'll be going through that legislation in a little detail. We'll also look at special legislation. In fact, more often than not, these districts are set up by some kind of special legislation. Hartford is a special legislation. Other smaller districts are done by special legislation. So we'll go through the differences there, and we'll look at the role of intermunicipal agreements. The enabling legislation or special legislation couldn't possibly address all of the issues related to putting a region together, and some things would be left to agreements among the communities. Excuse me. So that's the next step, and I'm sure we'll be in touch. We'll be talking with John and Rick about a date for that soon, and let you all know when that will be. Hopefully it will be within the next 45 days or so.
David, while we have everyone together here before we break up, going to ask Will or John if we can just have an update for everyone on where the engineering study is, what next steps are there, and when they should expect to see reports next.
We're expecting, and I'd be, if Will is on and open to speaking, or Mario as well, but our next deadline with Black and Veatch is the week of Christmas week, putting out where they are at the short list of alternatives.
That's right, John. Yeah, we're basically in the middle of task 3 of the study, anticipating delivering our report on task 3 right before Christmas. Then we're looking forward to finishing up the study into the new year.
So the idea being, and John, I would ask, maybe you just get an update of the schedule out to everyone of what task 3 is, what it contains. But the idea is we wanted to have these sessions with Collins Center to talk about governance models and to start to get into cost analysis and decision making for any type of regional system that might come out of this. When we get Black and Veatch's report at the end of the year, we're going to be looking at their recommendations for, hey, this is going to work, this is not going to work from an engineering perspective, or, whatever that discussion ends up being. And then from there, we're going to bring the two together. We're going to have a preferred alternative. We're going to be asking towns to, make some preliminary commitment to that, because then we're going to have to run some real numbers and gauge community interest for moving forward with some sort of a plan, or not. So, but everybody has, and I just always want to remind everyone of this. Everyone has their current cost schedule in the task, I think it's the task two reports that quantify for each plant and each system how much money each town is going to need to invest in capital and maintenance and operation over the next 20 years. That's what we're comparing against, folks, and those are the really tough numbers to deal with. So while it might be expensive to buy into a regional system that requires us to build new plants or expand an existing plant or something like that under a partial ownership, we've got to compare that to the cost of continuing to go your own ways, which I don't see any upside for almost anyone, with a couple of exceptions, in going your own way, because it's getting to the point where the user fees are going to be unsustainable.
Right, Rick. Those were all provided at the end of the phase 1 report that we put out early last year. You can see it. For anybody who doesn't have a copy, we did present it to every legislative body last spring, spring 2019. And it's also on the study page the study page on our website has all those figures. So they're sobering on every community's behalf, but it's worth looking at if you're not up to date on them.
Okay. I want to thank David and Sarah for their work on this so far, and we look forward to working with you to a successful conclusion of these reports. I want to thank everyone else for taking time out of their day today. We want to be respectful. We spent an hour and a half today. We'll try and be a little more efficient. I promise. I can't promise to talk less. It's just not possible. But I'll do my best. So thank you to everyone, and have a good day, and we'll be in touch.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks, guys. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.